Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Cherish Bedzinski.
Hello, and welcome to our third Exploring Intersections conversation about some of the biggest social issues of our time and the complex intersections of these topics with racism, migration, and climate. Please note, members of our live Zoom audience are encouraged to submit questions for our panelists to consider. You can do so by using the Q&A function. In this episode of Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, we're talking about migration. Today, our panelists take a look at how we can show compassion without borders and love without boundaries. What does it take to navigate legal systems to become a citizen of a different country? What are the root causes of inequity for those who migrate? And how do racism and climate change play into these complex issues? To help us explore today's topic, we are joined by three experts. Leslie Gonzalez Berrigan is originally from St. Paul, Minnesota. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and theology from the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Born and raised in an immigrant community, she has encountered the effects of migration firsthand among loved ones and community members. Her background and experiences have influenced her interest in faith-based social justice work, particularly working among migrant and marginalized communities, especially youth and young adults. Leslie has worked at the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development, and the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. All her experiences involve work with Latino communities and the marginalized, where migration is a constant topic and issue. She currently works in the Diversity and Inclusion Department of the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, Cherish. It's an honor to be here and to be with everyone present. I am working remotely in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm blessed for this opportunity.
Great. Our second guest is Sister Denise Larock, a member of the Daughters of Charity leadership team, most recently serving in San Antonio, Texas, where her ministry was to make newcomers who arrived from the border feel welcomed. A Maryland native, Sister Denise spent time improving her Spanish while living in Miami with daughters from the Caribe province. Once in San Antonio, she began her ministry with the Interfaith Welcome Coalition, greeting weary and fearful asylum seekers from Central America. During her daily presence at the city's bus station, she assisted with interpretation, bus schedules, and tickets while handing out backpacks filled with essentials and providing assurance that the asylum seekers were now in good hands. Equipped with clearance through Immigration and Customs and an enforcement clearance, she volunteered at the Chapel of the Family Detention Center in Dilley, Texas, and also volunteered at St. PJ's Home, an Office of Refugee Resettlement Shelter for unaccompanied minors. A daughter of charity for almost 30 years, Sister Denise has ministered as grade school teacher, established and directed 2 after-school tutoring programs for Hispanic at-risk students in Macon, Georgia, and Dover, Florida, and worked as the community's vocation director. Welcome, Sister Denise.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to promote welcoming immigrants today. Thank you.
And our third guest, Sister Joanne Mark, a Nebraska native, spent most of her ministry in higher education, primarily at Newman University in Wichita, Kansas, and Brescia University in Owensboro, Kentucky. She taught college math and science and served as academic dean and vice president. She has been to 12 countries, and taught English in Bucharest, Romania, and Tanzania, East Africa, and was active in her congregation's leadership locally and as a delegate to Rome. Her experiences inspired a keen interest in social justice, especially with minorities and asylum seekers. In 2015, she left Wichita to direct Partnership for Global Justice, a nonprofit in New York City, which took her to the United Nations. In 2018, she initiated a program in her community to open a vacant wing in the Adorers Convent to families of asylum seekers, primarily from the Congo. She prepared their legal papers for asylum applications and work permits, accompanied them to immigration court, and tutored and taught their children. Welcome, Sister Joanne.
Thank you very much, Cherish. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm very honored and grateful that you are discussing this topic because I think it is so very important.
And we are honored to have such knowledgeable guests with us today. Let's start the conversation by discussing what it was about the issues of migration that first became important to you. When did those issues become important to you? Sister Joanne, let's start with you.
Well, I had really been interested in social justice issues for years, and I was involved with a group here in Wichita called the Immigrant Support Services Network. And I also, when I was at Newman, I helped with HALO, the Hispanic American Leadership Organization. And these various groups, I guess at first it was more like working with the marginated, but gradually I came to see how those topics related to immigration, migration, and that's when I really became more involved in that topic.
Sister Denise, when did the issues of migration become important to you?
I think when I really started getting involved is when I went down to Florida to work at the Mercy School for migrant children. So we were teaching the children of agricultural farm workers who went between Ohio and Florida. And so I think that helped me understand more about the policies and the more intricacies, and there's more that we could do about it.
Great. And Leslie, how about you? You come in with a unique perspective among our panelists.
Well, this issue never really became important. It always was an issue and a topic in my life. It just became a stronger reality for me as the years went by because I did grow up in the immigrant community. I remember being really young and interpreting for community and family members. I remember being in school and seeing that as I grew older, my classmates started treating me differently or throw a racist joke my way. And in high school and in college is when I saw the injustices and difficulties that migrants in the nation faced. And so that's when migration was more than just an issue for me, but a social justice issue.
Absolutely. It seems that there is a widespread lack of understanding here in the United States and worldwide of the difficulties that these human beings are facing in their home countries and the reasons that they're seeking to leave. So let's talk about some of the many root causes of migration. Sister Denise, let's start with you.
I think there's so many, and I think a lot of people don't realize the tremendous push that brings immigrants here. I think one is poverty and food scarcity, the primary thing of providing for their children, corruption, violence in many forms, fighting over limited resources, domestic violence, and there's no recourse in cases of domestic violence. There's no protection possible. Organized crime that grew out of gangs who take over areas and feel they have control over everything and access to everyone. Failure of governments to protect their people. There's international corporations who come in. I've heard this particularly about Guatemala. and push people off their land. And in order to get access to the resources, things are grown like palm oil plants that we use for our products here and around the world. And I've even heard of land being taken for growing broccoli and cauliflower. So things that they would not use, but all these things being exported. There's also, especially we saw that this past year, the two hurricanes that happened, devastating, powerful hurricanes, people who barely had anything and lost what they had in that. And then before that, even they had a drought. So a lot of issues about related to climate change also really impact them.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that we'll continue to see impact migration in the future as the oceans continue to warm as well.
Mm.
Sister Joanne, anything to add to that about root causes? Oh, we can't. Great.
I better unmute, so I did that. I think that sometimes the way that they are treated, not just, like Sister Denise mentioned, but for instance, we knew a photojournalist who was very competent, very good, and he was videoing a peaceful demonstration. And then, the police came and they started mistreating people. And so he managed to escape. But then when he got home, he heard that his colleagues were coming to their homes and taking them and killing them. So he wanted to leave with his family. That was one of his main reasons. But I think another thing with mothers who have children, I heard a mother say, I can either keep this child with me and know that he will die, or I can send him hoping that he will make it safely. And those choices, I just cannot imagine having to make such a choice.
No, absolutely devastating to put yourself in that individual's shoes, for sure. And Leslie, I know you come at this from an entirely different angle. Tell us about the root causes in your experience that have led to migration.
I think I would have to echo what Sister Denise and Sister Joanne have mentioned, with a strong emphasis in just the poverty and the violence and persecution, political persecution that people have faced, and just the search for peace and a better life for their children.
And I think, if I might add, that I think one thing for women, so many of them are raped, and that's used as a weapon of war or whatever. So, I mean, that's a big issue too.
Yeah, absolutely. Leslie, staying with you on this, in your experience, what is the reality that migrants face when they reach our borders and when they try to make a life here? What are some of the challenges that they encounter?
I believe some of the challenges are, well, I'd like to touch on the challenges that come after one reaches the border and enters the country and is trying to start a life. There's a lot of basic things that perhaps most of us don't think about. We're so focused on aiding the process, but once we're here, that's when resources are hard to find, in the sense of, where should we live? Where can we work? Where can my children go to school? Where do I find religious services, get groceries? The ultimate question is, how do we start from scratch in a country that we don't know the geography of or the language? Those are the challenges that come, and the resources that I believe we need to work in administering as well, because it's difficult to start from scratch, and it's an ongoing thing. It's not a 1 or 2 year thing. It continues throughout your lifetime.
Yeah, and absolutely overwhelming issues. Sister Denise, I know you've worked with some of these issues firsthand. What are some of the challenges and realities that migrants face when they reach our borders in your experience?
I think the biggest part is our policies are aimed at stopping all asylum seekers from entering the United States and staying in the United States. So as an asylum seeker, you have to be on US ground to ask for asylum. So part of the strategy is like to stop that at all costs. Right now, there's still Title 42 going on, which says because of COVID, we can't let anybody in down at the border. So this surge we had in unaccompanied minors was due to a change in the process of saying, except for unaccompanied minors, they could be allowed in. So all these minors that we have been waiting at the border, suddenly they come in, as a surge where they've been waiting all that time. But also, there's an exception to sending everyone back into Mexico with those who have children of tender age, so like under 6 years old. But whether they're allowed in or not depends often on the mood and the attitude of the Border Patrol agent. So there's some very compassionate people, and there's some very unkind, prejudiced people too. And so even if someone is allowed to come, they're sent back over. Right now, so many families who are coming seeking asylum are being sent back into Mexico. Many who are coming now from into the Rio Grande Valley near McAllen area, they're taking them in buses and driving them over to Laredo and then putting them back into Nuevo Laredo. And if you know anything about the border down there, you'll know that Nuevo Laredo is a very dangerous place where the organized crime there is, they have a whole business model on kidnapping people and ransoming them and doing things to get the family to pay. So there's all those pieces that are so unwelcoming and just trying to push people back. And just last week, one of the new efforts to get to the root causes that was announced from the White House, we thought they were going to work on like helping the situation. Instead, money's going to go to further militarize the borders of the other countries. So instead of saying, how can we help make life better for people so they're not so desperate to leave their homes and their countries. Instead, we're just trying to trap them where they are. And it's just really sad, the lack of welcome at our border.
And that money is not going to solve those root causes that we're talking about, the complex issues.
Right. And desperate people do desperate things.
Mm-hmm.
And these families are very desperate to be able to live and be safe and protect their girls from being raped or their boys from being forced into the gangs, the organized crime, and it's join or die in those situations. And to come here and to have our whole process, the strategy of the whole process is to stop people from coming, not to be welcoming and keeping people safe. And in the last couple of years, the whole system has just been gutted. So even if they do get into the process, that areas for which they could previously get asylum have been taken away, such as the activity of the organized crime. They say, okay, that's not a good enough reason when it is totally life-threatening and controlling of areas. And then also domestic violence. I knew a woman, she had come to San Antonio. Well, I guess it was my first year there. And she's from Honduras, and she came up through Mexico, and she was raped on the way and became pregnant. And so she was dealing with, what do I do? And her reason for coming was domestic violence. And she said 6 other women had been killed by their partners. And there was no investigation, no nothing. Life just went on as normal. She said, I didn't want to be number 7. And yet we're saying, stay where you are. We don't want you here. And that's not what the church teaches us. If we really look at Catholic social teaching, it says to be welcoming, to care for your neighbor.
Yeah. I know femicide is such a huge issue in Central America. Sister Joanne, what would you add about the challenges that migrants encounter?
For sure, the language is a challenge. The ones that we have worked with came from like the Congo, and they knew French and Portuguese maybe, but those of us here at the center, we didn't know those languages. So that was a struggle for us. And of course, filling out the forms, they are not used to our language and our process. So they all want to work, but to be able to work, you have to have a work permit. So you have to request a work permit, and that costs money. And so where do you get what I think it's $400 now to request a work permit when you're not allowed to work? Well, needless to say, that encourages them to work, illegally, I guess you could say. So we kind of put them in a catch-22, I think. It's really difficult for them. The other thing is that, like, if they come across the border, they're an asylum seeker, they have an I-94, and they probably have a court date. Okay, so they have to go to court. So the court probably is not really close at hand, so they have to have someone to take them there. And once they go, like, it usually takes several trips to the court. And then after that, they have to actually present their case. And the courts are so backed up. Like the family I've been working with most recently came in 2019, and the court date for their actual asylum hearing is 2022. So, it's a long wait, and that's difficult. I think, as Sister Denise said, our policies and procedures are really designed, well, they're anti-friendly, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. Sister Joanne, staying with you here, let's consider the intersection of this issue with racism. How does racism come into play with migration in the US?
Well, I'm not real sure about some of that, but I would say that one way is the countries with which we are willing to cooperate and willing to give some status to, and the people we want are not from countries of color. They are from, countries like England or France, or places that we have agreements with, but which are not in dire need, like the people of Central America or the people of Africa. So I'm sure that in some way is based on some anti-racism, but I don't have any actual proof of that.
Mm-hmm. Leslie, let's go to you on this. How does racism play into this in your experience?
I think it plays in every aspect. I think there is structural racism. What I mean by that is a lot of the systems in place were created with racist notions. If you look at the history of immigration acts, you can very clearly see that. Even by the names of immigration acts, racism also exists in people's hearts ultimately. Racism, I define as a sin. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops called out racism to be America's original sin. Migration as a political issue and the prejudices that people have towards migrants and refugees, therefore create racist reactions, from the law calling migrants aliens in every documentation that they have to fill out, everyone having an alien number that they have to write down, to living in a community that constantly looks down on you. I mean, I personally cannot tell you how many times I've been to stores and heard people telling me and my family, to speak English or go back to the country you came from. Schools assuming, both high schools and colleges, universities, assuming that I'm undocumented, even though I've been born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. And even in parishes and dioceses where Hispanic ministry is an afterthought. 60% of Catholics ages 18 to 35 are Hispanic, where we don't receive half the resources in the diocese or parishes. I've been to communities where priests say it's too much work to learn about the Hispanic culture, for example, and therefore cannot serve them. So as a person of faith, seeing how immigrants and immigrant communities are treated in churches and parishes, what do you expect in the outside society? As someone that's been a part of these communities, I can say that racism and migration are just they're just part of each other, unfortunately.
Mhm. Sister Denise, anything to add about racism?
Yes, I would just really, affirm what Leslie was saying, that the racism is so built into our immigration system and history. Starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, you can just follow thing after thing, like how can we keep the brown and black people out? It just recurs through that whole piece. But yet we don't hear about all the people who overstay their visas, who are from Ireland or Poland, or when the percentage who overstay their visas are really the highest percentage, much higher than those who cross the border. But the focus is those who cross at our southern border, who are brown and black people. So the racism that is really involved in trying to keep those people out. And then, well, if they're white, we don't really care if they're overstaying their visa, or, they're doing fine, or they're contributing to society. So it's just so much part of who we say are worthy of staying and who's not worthy of staying, who's worthy of help and who's not worthy of help.
Mm-hmm. So some are saying that the US immigration system treats refugees and asylum seekers differently. How have all of you observed that to be the case? Do you have examples of that? And what role, if any, would you say that racism plays in that? Sister Denise, let's start with you.
So how do we treat both differently? I'd say many of those who are in the refugee program are people of color. And as we've seen through this process that push to lower the number and lower the number, and how can we even stop those, and how difficult can we make it? Again, that whole thing is like, if you're brown or black, let's do all we can to place as many obstacles in the way. For refugees, it's a whole different process. A lot of people don't understand the difference, but you have to go to another location and apply and to get accepted. And we had the bans on refugees that we've gone through. And I truly believe that if they were people who were white, we wouldn't be having that same conversation, that it wouldn't be such a limited time of help. So a refugee comes to the United States, we give them 90 days to set up their life and get self-sufficient. That is impossible. That is impossible. But yet we don't want to be generous in those cases. We, meaning in general, what we allow to happen. With immigrants too, so often where racism is involved in there too, is that what gets on the media and what's on the news is the negative. Maybe something that happened, the violence in their country, or something that happened in the United States, or that they come poor, and that becomes the focal point, rather than what they can contribute, how we depend on them. Our country is so dependent on the work of immigrants on all levels, in our fields, in our farms, in our factories. And then you go to the high-tech workers too. You never hear about those. We're much more welcoming of the high-tech, the brain power that can come. But even in recent years, there's been a push to exclude the visa workers who are from brown and black populations.
Hmm. Sister Joanne, anything to add about that, the difference between how refugees and asylum seekers are treated?
Refugees receive certain advantages that asylum seekers do not. Now, it's true what Sister Denise said, they have a limited time, but they can go to work when they come. They have a work permit. They are given some money. They're probably already helped to find a place to live. And none of that happens for the asylum seekers. So, it's very different. And I really get frustrated when people put all of them into one category, because the asylum seekers are really struggling, I think. And not to say that the refugees aren't, but it's a very different struggle for asylum seekers.
Yeah. And Leslie, anything to add on that?
I can only affirm what has been said. It's two both difficult paths in their own way. But the refugee path is a lot more structured than the asylum path, and it changes with every year.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important nuance that so many people, myself included, don't fully understand. So it's great that we're discussing that difference today. Since all of you work in support of migrants and refugees or refugees, I'm assuming that you would encourage us as a country to be more welcoming. And we have heard some of you speak to that point. What would you say to someone who says that the influx of migrants and refugees isn't good for our country? Is it in the best interest of our country to welcome migrants? And if so, why? Let's start with Sister Denise.
Well, I would say absolutely welcoming them, on every level. But I think I'll start with the business piece of it, because often it's an emotionally charged topic, and racism gets in there and all that. But I think if you just look at it on an economic level, we have less people being born in the United States. Our population is going down. We have huge businesses, technologies, services, tourism, all these things that need workers. And we're just starting to see now the impact of our not letting immigrants through. We're starting to see in the service sector not having enough staff, in nursing homes not having enough staff, the different businesses, our fields, all those different things are impacted by a lack of workers now. We're going to be paying a lot more for our fruit and our vegetables and all those things that need to end up being imported. And also, as I was saying, in the service area too, the impact it has. So I think on a business scale, if you want to be able to survive and your business to survive and for your country to grow and sustain, you need to have the workers. And in the United States, we have been dependent on immigrants for so much of that for forever. My family, part of my family came from Italy on a boat in the early 1900s. We went through some discrimination, but nothing to the extent that people go through now. Nothing to the extent. I mean, my family went through some bullying, and we went from La Roca to La Rock just to, fit in a little better. But it has such an impact on the well-being of everyone and the survival and the resources that we have.
Leslie, anything to add to that? What you would say to someone who says the number of migrants and refugees is not good for our country, or why it is in the best interest of our nation?
Yeah, it's definitely a very emotionally charged question, as Sister Denise has mentioned it, especially, as someone that identifies as an immigrant, even though I've always been in this country, you just can't help it but identify that way when you're always treated that way. So, what I would say to the first part of the question, what would I say to someone who said that the influx of migrants and refugees is not good? I would first ask, as I've asked before, what makes a person good enough to be in our country? What does a migrant or refugee have that we don't? Aren't we all created in the image and likeness of God? Aren't we all intrinsically good? I don't think any person that actually knows about Catholicism or Christianity would be able to say that a person isn't good without dehumanizing them. I would follow up by saying that it is in our best interest to welcome migrants, because ultimately migrants are leaving their home not because they want to, but because they're forced to. No one wants to leave their life and home and family behind. But as we've mentioned before, there's so many reasons why people are forced to do so. So they come here in search of peace and a better life. They know what violence and poverty look like. So in this country, they work hard to maintain that peace in this community. Migrants don't come here with an ill will. They come here with hope and with every desire to make this country what their country isn't. And they don't take this country and opportunities in vain. They can see that this is a place of hope. And it is very just sad and disheartening when they come here with all of these like feelings of hope and are faced with backlash and these kinds of questions. They're not good. Well, what does make you good? So it's definitely an emotional question, and we need an open heart and an open mind to be able to see that it's not such a difficult question to answer, really.
Sister Joanne, anything to add to that?
I think Leslie's answer was very powerful, but I would say that I think they add their cultural perspective, which I feel is really very beautiful and very wonderful for us. It gives us a broader worldview. It helps us to see the gifts that other cultures bring. And I mean, here in our community, that's really a blessing. And I also know that even though people may not realize this, when you give and open up to other people, you benefit as much or more than they do. So open your heart and you will find that there are many, many blessings for you personally.
Well said.
I'd just like to add one quick thing.
Sure.
I think we've all run into many people who don't know any immigrants, and they just know the news from the border or things like that. And I think one important thing to share are the stories that we have. I think often people at the border are statistics, they're numbers, how many came or how many are there. And I think it's up to us to enflesh the people that we know about, that immigrants aren't just this term or this enemy as some people consider them, but that real people, and share the stories and make their stories real. Why did they have to escape their country? What did they go through on the way? What are the hardships once they're here? As Leslie was saying, they have so many hardships once they're here. They don't have the support that refugees have, but that once they become more real, they're more our friends, our neighbors, those that we care about and we connect to. And I think that's very important to help break down those barriers.
It's a beautiful sentiment, and it restores their humanity, which I think is, what is removed and lost when we just think of them in terms of numbers. So politicians have been struggling for years with the question of how to reform our immigration system, and fear seems to drive so much of our immigration policy. In your experience, what have you found to be a productive approach to these complex issues? Sister Joanne, let's start with you.
I was afraid you were going to ask. Oh my, well, I do think we should give the DACAs a clear path to citizenship. I think that's one thing we can do, and it would benefit them and it would benefit the country, and it would just be a wonderful gift all around. So I think that's one thing. But I also think that all these issues that we've mentioned that make it so difficult for them, they need to be rethought, restructured, so that our laws and our policies are not so negative towards people. I know that Biden has said he wants it to be more humanitarian, and maybe that's a little harder to do than he realized now that he's in the position. But I do think that we need to really try to make people feel that they are part of our country. And like somebody said, they have gotten rid of the word alien in the communication. So I think that's a tiny, tiny step, but there are lots of little steps like that.
Yeah. Sister Denise, any thoughts on what is a more productive approach than fear when we look to address these issues?
Right. Well, I think part of it is motivating everybody that it is helpful and good, because I think right now there are many people who really enrich themselves through the exploitation of the immigrants. When I was in Florida, they had the winter strawberry crop, and they wouldn't hire anyone who had papers. I know someone who he just wanted the experience, and there's a seminarian, and to work with them. And when he went, with as an American, they wouldn't take him. And then when he came back and said he had no papers, they hired him. And then the end of the crop, the police started putting up checkpoints and arresting people. And so having immigrants was fine while they could use them, and then once the crops were picked, we have no need for you, go home. So I think part of it is the need that the farmers will have, the companies will have, that, and the getting the push of the businesses behind it, that if they want their crops to make it to market, if they want them picked and not rotting on the vine, like some of them are starting to have problems with, if they need workers, they're going to need to help push this too. And for so long, they've been pushing against it because they benefit from bad what they paying and all that, the wages that they pay, that they can pay practically nothing and take advantage or not pay people. So I think part of that would motivating and getting buy-in from the businesses and pressure from them, for also to help those who don't approve to see how it would be beneficial for their state, for their people, for their workers, for the future. I know even some states lost representatives this year because they were trying to restrict the census from immigrants. So if they had counted their immigrants, they'd have more representation in Congress. So there's a lot of pieces, and I think there's got to be a willingness to sit down and talk about it. I think in this polarized time, it's so easy to see everybody who's on the other side as your enemy, and we get nowhere because of that. But if we can at least sit down and say, okay, we agree on this and we agree on this, or how could this work? It doesn't mean that because I'm willing to work with you that I approve of everything you do. But there's got to be some reaching out and figuring out what would work for everybody, and especially for the immigrants who contribute so much and our country has been built on.
Mm-hmm. And Leslie, anything to add to that about our fear-based approach to policy?
Yes, first I'd love to affirm what has been said, and just strongly affirm what Sister Denise just mentioned of, we benefit from the work of migrants, and we shouldn't be afraid of what would be the word of retaliation if we were to give a path to citizenship or status. There won't, retaliation is not I believe, a worry or a fear that a lot of people hold, or that taking over sentiment. No, no one's taking over. People are just fulfilling jobs to keep our society running. No taking over, just picking up what needs to be done. I believe, to take away that fear, we need to continue with sharing stories, creating empathy, and really work on taking away that dehumanizing aspect of migrants, and start locally. I think local advocacy is a great start. I feel like more things can be done locally sometimes than federally. So starting with knowing what is happening with the migrant community in my community. How can I advocate with them? From topics as simple as driver's license to, bigger issues such as DACA. Who are the students in my colleges and universities that will be my dentist someday, that could be my lawyer someday, that could be my nurse someday? How do I get more of those services here? It's by advocating and looking at what's going on in your community.
We've started to get some questions from our live audience, and we've received a number of questions from people who would like our panelists to explain what the difference is between refugees and asylum seekers. I'll just open it up to anyone. What is the difference?
Well, part of the difference is that you have to receive refugee status from either the UN or some other NGO. And generally you have to have that before you come to the United States. Now, asylum seekers can just walk across the border and say that they are seeking asylum. So that's one of the differences from that perspective. And then I think earlier I talked about the difference in what they receive once they get here. Like the IRC provides services for refugees. Okay, so as Leslie said at one point, I think that they only have 90 days, but they do have 90 days, whereas the asylum seekers aren't giving anything like that. So, they get some money, they can get some cash, they can get a place to live, they have a work permit, and all those things. None of those are given to the asylum seekers initially when they come.
That's a really good overview. Sister Denise, I have a great question for you, and I think it's perfect for you given your expertise. Is it realistic to think that some of the governments in South and Central America are capable of creating change in their government structures that will improve the lives of their citizens?
That's a very good question. I'd love to know the answer to it.
Yeah.
I think any country can turn around. I mean, I'm an optimistic person, so I think something can be done, but there's got to be enough motivation. So like the administration's efforts now, their strategy to take care of the root causes are not taking care of the root causes. It's just further militarizing the borders and oppressing the people. So there has to be enough pressure. I mean, we pour millions of dollars into those countries to help them already. And we're going to give them tons more to militarize their border. If we would use that money in different ways, if we would advocate, if enough people speak up and say, we do not want our tax dollars to militarize these borders further, if there's enough pressure on that, I mean, that would be more effective, I would imagine. Now, how do you break down the power of the organized crime and how you do that? I mean, that's way above my pay grade. But it's clearly, that part needs to be broken down, and to have the country back in charge, so these other groups are not in charge and oppressing the people the way they do.
Great. Leslie, I think this would be a great question for you from an audience member. With such complicated work in assisting immigrants to secure a better life for themselves and their families, what do you do to keep yourself from being overwhelmed with frustrations?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think prayer, and that's something that I can say in this, public because of the faith-based lens that we're coming from. I think prayer and knowing that we can't do everything. No matter, I wish I could be in so many places, and I wish I could have so many careers. I want to be a lawyer, social worker, advocate. I want to be everything. But prayer is what keeps me grounded. Just asking God to give me the strength to accept the things that I cannot change. It's probably not what people want to hear, but at the end of the day, for me, it's the only thing that gives me peace personally. Because change is slow when we talk about this issue. So it might be better not for my generation, but perhaps my children or grandchildren. So I just pray for that.
Sister Joanne and Sister Denise, I imagine prayer plays into your restoration processes when you're on the cusp of being overwhelmed by these issues. Anything else?
I think having a support group. Now, when we had the asylum seekers, we had a group here who met weekly and talked about the issues. And, no one has all the answers. And all together, we can give some of the answers and we can encourage each other when things are not going well. So I really think a base of support, plus the prayer, of course, but I think a base of support is very important.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with what Leslie was saying about, taking it to prayer and putting things in God's hands. And I do my piece. If we all do our piece, we can make a big difference. And it's easy to get overwhelmed by all that's happening and all the hate we see and the treatment and the violence and all that, and the politics that just surround it all. But I think taking that time to be quiet, to reflect, to put life in perspective through prayer, we can say, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do? What is my task in this? My task is to just get on this webinar and to encourage people to do their piece, but if everyone did their piece, it'd make a big difference. And none of us are the savior or, someone who can take care of everything. And to keep that in mind and to have that discernment. Okay, what should I do? What should I not do? How do I spend my time and my energy?
So many times the nuances of these issues are just lost. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we're communicating now on social media. When you have a limited number of characters, you can't communicate all the many layers of these issues. But I think one thing that people could do is to share a conversation like this one with on their social media channels, and that at least gets people started thinking about there are no easy answers, but there are answers to these complex issues. So we have another question from our audience, and this naturally leads into our action items, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But what would you say are some concrete things that we can do to deal with migration? How can we make a difference in the process and in the interconnectedness of causes? It's a tough question. Who would like to take that one on?
Well, I certainly think that there are organizations, at least here in Wichita, to which one can belong, and that through them, you can do individual things, as what they were saying, but you can also have a greater impact on policy development. If you have a group, Sunflower Community Action Group is very active in this whole area. They have community gatherings like we had one on.
Oh, we lost your microphone, Sister Joanne.
We had a community gathering on the path to citizenship. Now, I mean, there weren't 1,000 people there, but there certainly was a committed crowd. And from them, you can, people will go out and talk to others. So I do think we need to have a perspective that is broader than just my piece here.
Mhm. I think also on the website for Exploring Intersections, there's several different websites that are available to be informed, to get on their listserv and know what's going on. It's hard to keep up with what's going on because things are constantly changing and evolving, but they will send action alerts like this policy, call about this, or email about this. With the case of how we're going to deal with the root causes, I'm sure something will come up like that. And just having your voice heard, letting your members of Congress know that you care and you're not going to vote for them if they don't, change their ways, because that's where it gets to them. So advocating on that. So the two pieces, the advocating, but then also the humanitarian issues that Leslie had brought up earlier about in your destination locations.
Great. And we are nearing the end of our conversation. So we're going to move into action items. Each of our panelists has suggested an action item for us to embrace as we move forward. Sister Joanne, we'll start with you. Tell us about your action item.
My action item has to do with really getting to know some migrants, maybe a family, but more than just, putting some money in a collection or doing something like that, but really getting to know them as family with children. And that, I think, changes one's attitude dramatically. And I did send a number of places to put on the webpage where you could do some volunteering. I know I volunteered at La Providencia and Casa Maranella, and you get to know people in a very different way than when you just, I guess, sit in your own place and talk to those who are next door to you. Anyway, that's my suggestion for action. Really get to know some migrants.
Perfect. And Sister Denise, your action item is a perfect segue from that. Tell us
right.
about.
So this is back to what Leslie was sharing previously about not forgetting about the immigrants once they get to their location. There's a lot of publicity and help at the border, but once they get to where they're going, seek them out in your local area. If you don't know where they are, the parishes that have masses in other languages, especially Spanish, they would know who needs help. Catholic charities in different places, different dioceses would be great ways to connect also and find people in your area who need the accompaniment. It's not always they need stuff. Sometimes they just need to know where to go or how to, do the system.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And Leslie, tell us about your action item.
Yes, I definitely understand that, migration, immigration, refugee work is not for everyone. So my action item is more centered around encouraging people to do what they can, what they're comfortable with doing in their capacity. There's always places to donate to if you don't have the comfort or, the time. You can still make room in your heart and seek out places that are comfortable doing that. You can donate to nonprofits, law offices, consulates, or your own services, whatever services you like to offer that your profession might be, you can do that as well. And I also want to affirm the fact that migrants don't stop being migrants after entering their country. Their children are also identify as migrants. I can say that and speak for myself in that sense. Born and raised in this country, I still identify as an immigrant, and I will, I think, till the day I die, because I just don't feel welcomed. So a simple smile, a simple hello, and viewing the neighbors, even in your own parishes, and seeing them with the eyes of Christ. I can almost assure that there are services with migrant communities at your parish before or after the times that you usually go in for service. So look for those, or offer a prayer for the change of hearts in the community.
Great action items. More information on these action items and this topic as a whole can be found on our website. Thank you, Sister Joanne, Sister Denise, and Leslie. We're so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise on this topic and for the important work you're doing to address these complex issues. Thanks.
Thank you for
Sherry.
having us.
Thank you.
And a special thank you to all of the women behind the scenes, the communications professionals, the tech team, and many others who make this program possible. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, Racial Justice. In the United States, entire segments of our population have been historically denied their rights based on their race. What does racial justice look like? How does that differ from restorative justice? And how do we recognize and eliminate systemic racism and inequities? We've got big questions to consider, and our panelists will help us better understand what's at stake and how to address these issues with love and compassion. I hope you'll join us for this conversation. That's June 9th at 3 p.m. Central Time. You can register to attend our live broadcast through our website. Thank you for being here today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation and to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. If you'd like to revisit this conversation or a past program, you can find it on our YouTube channel or download a podcast version from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or just go to our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on Facebook. I'm Cherish Badzinski, and thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.